was a Gentile. Now, let's read down through the text and then back up and make a couple of points as we go down through it a second time. Let's start reading in verse 1 of Mark chapter 5. They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. And when Jesus had stepped out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. He lived among the tombs, and no one could bind him any more, not even with a chain. For he had often been bound with shackles and chains, but he wrenched the chains apart. He broke the shackles in pieces. No one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones. And when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and fell down before him, and crying out with a loud voice, he said, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." For he was saying to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." And Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" He replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And he begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now, a great herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside, and they begged him, saying, "Send us to the pigs, let us enter them." So he gave them permission, and the unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and were drowned in the sea. The herdsmen fled and told it in the city and in the country, and people came out to see what it was that had happened. And they came to Jesus and saw the demon-possessed man, the one who had had the legion, sitting there, clothed, and in his right mind. And they were afraid. And those who had seen it described to them what had happened to the demon-possessed man and to the pigs. And they began to beg Jesus to depart from their region. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed with demons begged him that he might be with him. And he did not permit him, but said to him, "Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you." And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone marveled. I love that story. And I love what it teaches us about Jesus. And I hope by the end of our time this morning that you love Jesus even more than you do right now. But let's back up to the beginning of the chapter, and let's take a second to emphasize the condition of this man. Because it's pretty dramatic. His living circumstances, his physical condition. What we see in verses 2 and 3 is that this was an unclean man living amongst the dead. He's living in the tombs. I mean, for Jews, that was just unheard of. If you were to touch a dead body or walk over the top of a grave, you were considered unclean. But this man is living in the graveyard. Someone made the point once that this is almost like a dead man walking. I mean, he has no more hope in this life, no more attachment in this life. He's basically the shell of a man. He's hopeless. Because his friends and family have tried to do what they could for him. They tried to restrain him. They tried to help them, but they were powerless to do that. Because anytime they tried to restrain him, to keep him from hurting himself, supernaturally, because of the demons, he was breaking chains and shackles apart. And maybe that's a theme to run down through Mark chapter 5. You have this man that no one can help. You have the woman with the flow of blood that has spent all of her money on doctors, and there's no relief. You have the little girl who's dead. No one can do anything about that. But in each of those circumstances, Jesus intervenes. There were people that tried to help him, but they were unable to. He was out of control. He was someone that was violently out of control. No one had the strength to subdue him. Look at verse 5. He was exhausted. I've heard some kids in the auditorium this morning. Any young parents out there? Exhausted. We talk about, so when do they start sleeping through the night? This man, according to verse 5, night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out. He wasn't sleeping. Dark circles, deep bags under his eyes, exhausted. He was hurting himself. He was being compelled to hurt himself. In verse 5, it says he was cutting himself with stones. What do you think that looked like? Over a period of time, he would have had scars. He would have had some fresh wounds. You know it's bad when someone starts doing that. And then in verse 6, you see his desperation. Jesus steps out of the boat and he runs up to him, and you get this intermingling. Who's talking? Who's acting? Because he rushes toward Jesus, but then Legion speaks. He falls at the feet of Jesus, but Legion says, "Leave us alone." But you know internally the man really wants Jesus to do something. You see this conflict inside of him. And when he speaks, his volume control is broken. Have you ever interacted with somebody that only had one volume setting? The parents will say, use your inside voice. Use your inside voice. This guy had no inside voice. He ran right up to Jesus and he yells out, "What have you to do with me, Jesus?" And I want to, just for a second, put yourself in the position of the apostles who had sailed over with Jesus. They don't know what they're doing. They don't know why they're going over there. They're just going with Jesus. And as they all get out of the boat, this unclothed, crazy-looking, exhausted-looking, out-of-control wild man rushes at Jesus and starts screaming. I mean, the apostles, on good days, were trying to slow children from coming to Jesus. I can see them starting to rush up and try to create a barrier. But Jesus interacts with this man because Jesus had been telling the legion to come out. From an external perspective, this man looked like a lost cause, but not to Jesus. Jesus ends up healing him. He casts the legion, these demons, into the herd of swine, 2,000. The swine rush down and they disappear into the sea. They die in the sea. The herdsmen flee in verse 14 and tell everybody what just happened. And then everyone comes back. And what they are afraid of, look at verse 15. They came to Jesus and saw the demon-possessed man, the one who had had the legion. They're not freaked out by the dead swine. They're not scared and repulsed by the stench. What terrifies them is seeing this out-of-control man in his right mind again. Jesus had done something none of them could do. What they saw when they showed up was he was sitting, which means he's back in control of himself. He's in control. He's dressed. He hasn't been for a long time. And he's in his right mind. He's able to talk and reason. There's no more question. Is it this guy talking or is it the 2,000 demons inside of him? You could tell. It was him. And who knows how long that had been going on. And they were so scared, they asked Jesus to leave. And Jesus acquiesced. He went to get into the boat. And this is why I want to talk about discipleship using this man. Because what this man wanted to do was to go with and follow Jesus. Verse 18, as Jesus was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed with demons begged him that he might be with him. There's a whole lot about Jesus he does not know. He doesn't know all of the teaching Jesus has done. He probably doesn't know about all these claims to messiahship. He's only interacted with him for a couple of hours. But what he does know is that Jesus was able to do something that no one else was able to do, and he wants to go with him. And that's a disciple. I know what I know about Jesus. I'm always going to be learning and growing. But what I do know is I'm following him. Right? So let's talk about discipleship and make a couple of quick points. Starting in Psalm 20, if you were to say, what are the first few things that you would tell someone about the nature of discipleship? Where does discipleship start? And you could go to the Old Testament, and starting with Psalm 20, talking about following God, look at what the psalmist said. Now I know that the Lord saves his anointed. He will answer him from his holy heaven with the saving might of his right hand. Some trust in chariots, some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. They collapse and fall, but we rise and stand upright. Discipleship, even in the Old Testament, starts with trust. We would also say faith. I believe something about the person that I am following. In the Old Testament, the object of that trust was God. Some people trust in chariots, some people trust in horses, but our source of trust, we trust in the name of the Lord our God. What's interesting is when you get to the New Testament, Jesus helps redirect people by saying, the trust that you have been placing in God, now you place that trust in me. Let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. The trust, the faith that is owed to God, now you give that to Jesus. How does discipleship start? It starts with trusting in Jesus. And to the degree that he was able, that's what that demoniac did. He trusted in what he knew about Jesus, as little as it was. And we've already mentioned the next part when you're talking about discipleship. In Mark chapter 5 and verse 18, as Jesus was going to get into the boat, he begs to go with him, that he might be with him. The thing that disciples do after they've placed their trust in Christ is they want to follow. I want to follow my Savior. I want to follow my Lord. Think about some of these passages. Matthew chapter 10, verses 38 and 39. Whoever does not take up his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Or in Mark, if you go forward a couple of chapters to Mark chapter 8, verses 34 and 35, Mark records the same thing. Calling the crowd to him with his disciples, he said to them, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. Matthew chapter 19, verse 21, Jesus said to him, if you'd be perfect, go sell what you possess, give to the poor, you will have treasure in heaven, and come, follow me. To the degree that he was able, the demoniac wanted to follow Jesus. He placed his trust in Jesus. He wanted to follow Jesus. And I just want to take a second. I didn't always take a second to do this, but the longer that I have served as an evangelist and a teacher, this needs to be said, and needs to be said more often. It is really easy to point out the biblical truth that disciples trust and follow. That's absolutely true. We place our faith in Jesus and we follow. Without faith, it's impossible to please him. That is a requirement. But there's something that I've learned over time, and I wish I had understood it better when I was younger. Trust and following is harder for some people than others. The requirement does not change, but it's harder for some people than others. And we need to be patient, and we need to encourage, and we need to come alongside those people. This is what I mean. It is really easy for me, who grew up in a stable nuclear family. My parents have only ever been married to each other. They've been married to each other for 4+ decades. But neither of my parents came from intact, stable homes. There are things about my relationship with my parents where it's easier for me to trust them than it was for them to trust their parents because they came from really volatile home lives. And if you have somebody that has, in their experience of life, been hurt or wounded or suffered in some way, trust is still required, but it's more expensive for them. It's harder for them. And it's riskier for them. And so we want to take a second to acknowledge that. It's still required, but let's be patient with each other and help come alongside people where it's harder for them to run the risk of trusting. And what I want to say about God is, in our experience, what we've learned, which is incorrect, is that trust is always broken. With God, it never is. People will fail us. People will let us down. People may hurt us. God does not. So, disciples trust Jesus. Disciples follow Jesus. Let's come again down to verses 19 and 20. 19 and 20. He wanted to go with Jesus, but Jesus did not permit him, but said to him, "Go home. Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you." And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone marveled. All of us have had the experience of being told no. Whether it was a parent, whether it was a teacher, whether it was another authority figure, we make a request and the answer is no. What is wrong with that request? You've just been delivered. You've just been saved. You want to go with the one who is able to do what no one else could do. You've been alone for whatever period of time. You've essentially been a dead man walking in the grave. You want to go with the one who has given you life back. It seems like a natural request. And Jesus doesn't give a whole lot of reasoning. He just says, no. Go home and tell everybody what I've done. And this man had so much respect for Jesus that despite what he wanted to do, he submitted. And he listened. And he went back. What does that teach us? There's a lot about Jesus he doesn't know yet, and I think as he came to learn more about Jesus, he would have recognized this. Disciples learn from and imitate Jesus. Disciples learn from and imitate Jesus. Jesus understood submission. Jesus understood when God told him no. Jesus understood what it was like to do what God told you to do, even if you didn't necessarily want to do it. Think about the night before the night of his betrayal and arrest. As he's praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, if there is any way to do this any differently, if there's any way to not drink this cup, but your will be done. And God said no to Jesus' request. Disciples will become more and more and more and more like their Lord. Think about passages like 1 Corinthians 10, 33 through 11:1. Paul said, "Just as I try to please everyone in everything I do, not seeking my own advantage, but that of many, that they may be saved, be imitators of me as I am of Christ." Disciples imitate Christ. 1 Peter 2:21, talking about suffering that those folks would be going through. Peter wrote, "To this you've been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so that you might follow in his steps." And then in Matthew 10:24 and 25, Jesus said this, "A disciple is not above his teacher, nor a servant above his master. It's enough for the disciple to be like his teacher." This is totally different than just getting an education. You know, you go to school, you go to colleges, you go to universities, and you're there to gain the information that you need to do the job that you want to do someday. You're trying to get the information that you need to pass the tests as they come through, the exams, all of those things. Being a Christian is not about getting an education. It's about becoming like the teacher. I want to become more like him in his loves and in what he despises. I want to become more like him in his character and in his goals. I want to learn to talk like Jesus. Disciples learn from and imitate Jesus. Just a couple more points, and the lesson will be yours. As we go back to Mark chapter 5, verses 19 and 20, when Jesus sent him back, what he told him to do was tell them how much the Lord has done. And so he began to proclaim. The word there in the Greek has to do with evangelism. To tell everybody how much Jesus had done for him. Have you ever been intimidated by evangelism? You ever been intimidated by that? Maybe you're afraid you're going to be asked a question you don't have the answer to. It's going to happen, right? Or maybe after the conversation, or maybe you won't even get the conversation. Doors are going to be closed in your face, or someone's going to say no. Maybe someone's just going to be outright rude. That can happen. But you know what Jesus asked this man to do? Just go and tell people what God has done for you. That's it. And it hasn't been a lot. We're talking one day with Jesus. He asked him to do what he was able to do. Just tell people what God has done. And if that's how you start evangelism, that's great. You just go and you tell people what God has done for you because you know that. You know what God has done for you. You know how good he's been to you. You know what he's delivered you from, what he's saved you from, what he's delivered you for. As we talk about discipleship, what disciples do is they make other disciples. They tell everybody what God has done for them, and they make other disciples. This last point is my favorite. This last point is my favorite, and we have to look at a larger context to accomplish this. We're going to have to go outside of Mark chapter 4. We're going to need to back up to Mark chapter 5. Mark chapter 4. Go to Mark chapter 4, and let's start reading in verse 35. What Mark records is, on that day when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was, and other boats were with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And he said to them, "Why were you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" We teach that story to our kids at such a young age. Anything having to do with water. We talk about Jesus calming the sea. We talk about Peter walking and starting to sink in the sea. Here it's the calming of the sea. Do you know what we fail to do? We fail to connect the calming of the sea with the healing of the demoniac like we should, because there's a big fat number 5 in between the two paragraphs. We think that big chapter break separates the stories. They don't. What I would like to do is I want to keep track of the boat really quick. So on that day, in verse 35 of chapter 4, on that day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." So they leave the crowd, they get in the boat, they go to the other side. Where were they going? To the land of the Gerasenes. So in verse 1, they came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. And when Jesus had stepped out of the boat, he's approached. But at the end, you remember the people begged him to leave. So he got back into the boat. And then in verse 21, when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, he was back home in Capernaum. A great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Do you see where this is going? Have you ever had someone ask, if Jesus could only save one person, would he still have left heaven? Yes. I don't even hesitate to answer that. Why do I say that? Because according to Mark's gospel, Jesus crossed a stormy sea for a couple of hours to heal a demon-possessed Gentile and then go home. He had so much love for that man that he crossed a stormy sea, and when he was asked to leave, went back. What does that tell you about the love of Christ? That it's immense. If Jesus was willing to cross a stormy sea to save one Gentile, then he would come only if he was able to save me. And if that doesn't make you love Jesus more, we need to have more conversations. What does that have to do with discipleship? Disciples abide in the love of Christ. I recognize what that man recognized. Jesus is the only one, and I'm going to go with him, and I want to be with him, and I'm going to listen to him, and I'm going to stay right here. I don't care what anybody else may say about Jesus. He is my Lord. And I want to tell everybody about that Lord. But as far as his love for me, I'm not going to question that. I'm going to camp right in the love of Christ. Now, how do you wrap up a lesson on discipleship? I think the text does a fantastic job. I want you to notice a repeated word down through this first half of the chapter. And what I'd like you to do is there are three groups of people or three individuals that have a response to Jesus, and I want you to see their responses. You have the man as he is possessed by legion. And when Jesus gets out of the boat in verse 6, he runs up and legion is talking. And legion acknowledges that he is Jesus, the Son of the Most High God. He acknowledges Jesus for who he is. It's the demons speaking. And he begs Jesus, leave me alone, don't torment me. But then you get to verse 10. And that demon-possessed man, as the demons are speaking, they beg Jesus, please don't send us away. And then they beg in verse 12, just put us in the pigs. And the key word there is beg. They are pleading with Jesus. Just put us over there. When the townspeople come out to see what had happened, and they see the man sitting and clothed and in his right mind in verse 15, and they're terrified. And they hear what happened to the animals. They get to verse 17. They beg Jesus, leave us alone. Go away. And Jesus does. But then you get the demon-possessed man in his right mind in verse 18. And as Jesus is getting into the boat, what the man does is he begs, I want to go with you. And so you have three responses. You have the demons saying, leave us alone, cast us over here. We acknowledge you for who you are, but we don't want to have anything to do with you. And Jesus acknowledges that. And then you have the townspeople. We have no clue what's going on, but this scares us. We don't want to know anymore. Leave us alone. And so Jesus leaves them alone. But then you've got the recovered demoniac who begs, I want to be with you and I want to go with you. And the challenge of Mark, I think, is this, and this is the conclusion. You have to figure out how you're going to respond to Jesus. Are you going to acknowledge him, but then say, oh, just leave me be? Because Jesus will. Or are you going to be like the townspeople? We don't really understand what's going on here, but leave us alone. Jesus is not going to force himself on you. Or do we want to be like the recovered demoniac who says, I don't know everything that's going on here, but I know enough, and whoever you are, I want to be with you. Is that your response? Think about your response to Jesus. And which one of those groups best describes you? My hope is that for the disciples that are in the room, that we develop that zeal to be with Jesus even more after this sermon this morning. But maybe you're not a disciple yet. Let's talk about that. If there's someone who wants to become a Christian, someone who wants to become a follower, a learner of Jesus, they want to place their trust in him, they want to tell other people about him and make other disciples, they want to abide in the love of Christ, we'd like to help you do that. We'd like to help you be baptized into Christ for the remission of your sin. But if you're not quite there, you need some help thinking through who Jesus is a little bit more, I'm sure there are plenty of people here that would love to talk to you about that. Wherever you are in your response to Jesus, would you please reconsider him? And if you're a disciple, please grow in your zeal for him. Think about those things as we stand and as we sing.